Good morning. Thank you for joining us for the Toxicology and Societies, the Impacts of Chemicals in Our Lives speaker series. This is our final speaker series presentation in the 2021-22 academic year, and it concludes the second year of our series. I'm Ruth Sofield, an environmental toxicology and chemistry professor at Western Washington University. My co-host is Tracy Collier.
Hey, Ruth. Good
Hi,
to see
Tracy.
you. Camera, welcome.
Welcome. He's a toxicologist who's retired from NOAA's Northwest Fisheries Science Center and continues his work as a consultant. We would like to begin by acknowledging that we at Western Washington University are on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. Please join us in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude for our Indigenous neighbors, the Lummi Nation and Nooksack tribe, for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. And now I'd like to go over a few logistics. We will save questions for the end of the presentation, but you can use the Q&A feature on your screen at any time. You will be muted throughout the presentation, so we will use this feature to interact. The focus of our speaker series is to present understandable examples of how events with a toxicological component have consequences to people and society. We are happy to welcome Dr. Tamara James-Todd today. Dr. James-Todd is the Mark and Catherine Winkler Associate Professor of Environmental Reproduction and Perinatal Epidemiology in the Departments of Environmental Health and Epidemiology in the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She also directs the Environmental Reproductive Justice Lab, which seeks to investigate and improve adverse environmental exposure and reproductive health disparities. Today, Dr. James-Todd will discuss epidemiologic studies evaluating the evidence of endocrine disrupting chemicals on women's reproductive health outcomes with an environmental justice framework. Welcome, Dr. James-Todd.
Thank you so much for this invitation and kind invite. If I can be allowed to share screen, I will do so. It's really a pleasure to be here with everyone today. Let's see. All right, can you see that, Ruth?
And thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in to make sure that we have time for questions. And I'll just be noting that while this is the title, I definitely will be focusing in on some epidemiologic evidence. I really want to highlight that a lot of this talk is going to be speaking to, what is the role of using an environmental justice framework, perhaps as a toxicologist. I am an epidemiologist and not a toxicologist, but I do work closely with toxicologists in some of the work that I do. I just want to say that I have no conflict of interest, and these are my funding sources. And so to make sure that we're all on the same page, I would like to lay out several definitions that will be key to this presentation. And first, I would like to provide a definition for environmental justice. There are many. I am using one from the Environmental Protection Agency that really highlights the need for fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of their background, whether that, race, ethnicity, color, nationality, and so on. And this is really with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of the laws that regulate environment and the policies that regulate and implement and enforce environmental laws. Likewise, I'll be talking a lot about reproductive health today, so I would be remiss not to define reproductive justice. And this is really the human right to control our sexuality, our gender, and our work and reproduction. This comes from the Sister Song Community Health Organization. Health disparity then is defined by Healthy People 2020 here, and it's really a particular type of difference that is closely linked to social, economic, and environmental disadvantage, of which the latter we will be speaking about today more extensively. And I would be remiss to not define health equity, which really sits at the core of anything when we're talking about environmental justice. And so health equity is the principle underlying the commitment to reduce and ultimately eliminate disparities in health and the determinants, including social determinants. And this is by Braveman et al. So I know that none of us is probably unfamiliar with this wheel or this idea of research really being on a continuum. And I recognize that I've kindly been invited by a department that may have more basic scientists than population health scientists. But this really, this idea that there's real interplay across this continuum, that we inform each other's work. And whether that's, at the stage of identifying particular opportunities or approaches to evaluate health problems through basic science, all the way to really being able to move into discovery, beyond discovery mode and into like health application, dissemination, and really evaluating things at the population level. And I make mention of this because I wonder when I recently developed an environmental justice course with the idea of making sure that basic scientists all the way to population health scientists were able to take this course. And one of the questions that we were asked as we were developing this and designing this course was really, how exactly could a basic scientist really think about the link or inclusion of environmental justice in their research? And I would say that, if we really think about the definition of what is toxicology, this is actually coming from the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, that it's really, helps us to understand the harmful effects of chemical substances, et cetera, on human health, then, understanding the unique exposures, concentrations, and situations by which those exposures take place within particularly marginalized populations is key to really moving us from an unjust situation to a just situation. And likewise, if we really are going to define it as, say, for example, the science of safety, which again, some may define toxicology as, it's really understanding how we can make things safe for all. And so that, again, removing the barriers, not just, making it, down here where equality sits, like giving everybody the same, or maybe even trying to provide some resources to improve, but really taking down the barriers. And I hope throughout this talk, you'll be able to see my suggestions for how we might be able to do that. So I would like to start with, it's in the questions we ask. And so as an epidemiologist, I spend a lot of time thinking about what environmental factors might be associated with a particular health outcome. Exposure scientists may spend a lot of time thinking about, what are the particular exposures or chemicals, and other, individuals who study public health may think about what are the disparate conditions and what are the patterns that we see. Likewise, we spend a lot of time in the space of science, public health, and related fields, thinking about the who is at risk of high exposure, who has a high disease burden, where. So thinking about where are the places where we see the greatest exposure or the greatest risk, or even differences in the patterns of exposures that may occur. So I'm going to be spending a lot of time talking about phthalates. You'll hear me talk about this more in a few minutes. And so the different types of phthalates that are used in different geographic areas, for example. So thinking about critical periods, some years ago, I had a chance to sit on the EPA's Chemical Advisory Committee. And so it's definitely, it was a great opportunity to, again, connect with toxicologists and other public health scientists, and really recognizing that the critical window of prenatal period is a really important period, as is pregnancy and other periods of life. And so understanding what exposures may happen during those windows that could have real implications for health outcomes. And likewise, thinking about the how, what are the mechanisms, whether those are genetic, epigenetic, hormonal, and for those of us who study social and behavioral factors that really might be at play that can impact health, and how those mechanisms are at play to impact our biology. But I think that there's some key forgotten questions. And I would like to suggest that the question of why is often left out of these conversations. So why do some populations have higher exposure? Why do certain populations have higher disease burden? And is there a connection between the two? And what can we do about it? Kind of so what, if you will. And I think asking these questions is critically important. Even if you're a basic scientist, oftentimes we're funded by the National Institutes of Health. And these are taxpayer dollars that are being used by us, and we are the stewards. We are, it's our privilege to be able to do research in these areas. So asking why really helps us to develop, an opportunity to build trust among the American and the US public or other funders to really be looking at questions that are relevant to high exposed populations, high risk populations, and often understudied populations. It also is an opportunity for us to develop solution-oriented questions. And so really thinking about how those questions can be translated into sustainable and well thought out interventions and really be effective at the policy level for example, being able to remove certain chemicals that might be found in certain products that, and you'll hear me talk a little bit more about that, or social change that might be needed to improve health. And so when we start doing that, when we start asking the question of why, we realize that it's not just, as simple as does chemical X, is that associated with outcome Y? But really it gets down to the examples of the patterning of these things and how those are oftentimes inequitable, perhaps due to structural racism or the interactions with stress or differences in exposure due to workplace access and availability, housing injustice and energy injustice issues, as well as beauty injustice issues. And the key here is that when we start thinking about this, we don't go into a space where things are, deterministic and purely, someone is, of this particular background, therefore they are going to develop this condition, but it's recognizing that these things are modifiable and we can actually do something about them. And so I'd like to give you this concept of a translational epidemiologic approach that I do think can be applied to other disciplines. And so really this idea that it's not just purely focusing here on these downstream elements of the, say, environmental exposure. Here, these are just examples in these darker blue boxes. They are not an exhaustive list of any of these, but just examples of the lighter blue boxes. But that we won't get so hung up on just staying down here, looking at the environmental exposure and its impact on the health outcome, but that we take into consideration the upstream factors. What are the behaviors? What are the social or cultural contextual factors that are at play? What are the policies that are at play that really impact these downstream factors and really have influence on our health? So why would a toxicologist or a basic scientist need to take into consideration these structural factors? And I would just like to suggest that, people are exposed to different things based on these structural factors, whether we're talking about, as we've seen with this current COVID pandemic and the data that has already really shown and highlighted how air pollution can exacerbate COVID, for example, and that we know that that's differentially distributed in the population. And so together, things like air pollution and infectious disease and our genes can interact and really have influence and impact on our body's responses to all of these things. Also, just recognizing that stress and deprivation, such as living in a food desert or discrimination or occupational exposures, really have impact on health outcomes. And that when we do take these things into consideration, it can really lead to valuable and informative public health impact, because that's, people aren't just their exposures, they are the accumulation of many, many different factors. So that idea is, in the context of reproductive health, is that there are different populations of people. Here, I'm oversimplifying this by suggesting that there's, for example, a disadvantaged group and a more advantaged group. And that in the disadvantaged group, there are many, many more of these risk factors that I just mentioned, whether those were, issues of food deprivation or food insecurity, increased air pollution, or even these chemicals that I'm going to be speaking about a lot today. And so there's many, many more of these red arrows compared to many fewer of these blue arrows or these protective factors or resilience factors in the disadvantaged community compared to the advantaged community. And that can accumulate over an individual's life course with real implications for the incidence for adverse health outcomes that could occur across the life course. So really the issue at hand is, how can we do our science better or in a more environmentally informed way that incorporates this issue of environmental justice? And I would say we have spent a lot of time in problem identification mode, and that is incredibly, incredibly important. We know that there are certain things such as environmental chemicals that are harmful for human health. But how do we move from the problem identification mode into designing informed and solution-oriented research, and then really getting into the space where we can implement and modify accordingly to really achieve health equity? So I'm going to use an example throughout this talk. There are many that I could have used, but this example allows us to go deeper. Also just noting that when I talk about environmental justice and health inequity, it is not limited to racial ethnic differences. There are a host of, unfortunately, of social and contextual factors that I could have spoken about, from ability difference to gender differences, and socioeconomic status, urban versus rural, and so on. But today I'll be focusing on racial ethnic differences in pregnancy outcomes, and really thinking about how might the environment contribute to disparities. So the first thing I would like to make sure that we're all on the same page about is this issue of problem identification. Is there indeed an environmental health disparity? And I would like to posit that in order for an environmental health disparity to exist, there need to be three conditions met. So first, there needs to be a condition that there is an association between the less advantaged group and the health outcome that we're interested in. And the example I will be using today is looking at race, ethnicity, and preterm birth. So in this case, there's an association between non-Hispanic Black, race, and preterm birth. Second, that there is an association between a less advantaged group and the environmental exposure. And so I'm going to be focusing in on a set of chemicals known as phthalates. I'll give you a little bit more background about that in a second. But in this particular, for this condition to be satisfied, there has to be an association between non-Hispanic Black race and phthalate metabolite concentrations. And then lastly, that there has to be an association between the environmental exposure and the health outcome of interest. And again, these chemicals and preterm birth for this condition to be met, there must be an association there. So to evaluate that first condition, is there an association between the less advantaged group and the health outcome of interest? This is data from the March of Dimes, published in this year, 2022, and it shows the average preterm birth by race, looking at percent of live births. And so you'll note here that compared to, for example, white individuals, Black individuals experience much more preterm birth. We also see that for other racial ethnic groups, but it's worth noting that it's about a 50% roughly increased risk. So that first condition is met, and moving on to the second, where we are looking at the disadvantaged group and the environmental exposure of interest. Again, I mentioned this term phthalates. And so phthalates are found in a variety of personal care products, diet and food packaging, and medical tubing. And so what I'm showing here is data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. We published this back in 2001 to 2008. I will sadly say to you all that we just recently are doing an updated analysis. And not only do we see these same differences by both gender here, which women are represented in red here, and then race ethnicity with African Americans represented in red and Mexican Americans represented in green. We not only see the same difference, unfortunately, but we also see that it's increasing for some, this disparity is increasing for some of these chemical exposures, which is quite worrisome when we're thinking about this. And so that was data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey in non-pregnant individuals, but I'm going to be talking about pregnancy. So I wanted to highlight what do we see in the context of pregnancy. And so I'm showing you data from the Life Codes pregnancy cohort, which is based here in the Boston area. This is data from over 300 individuals across pregnancy, which is represented here on the x-axis, and the concentrations are on the y-axis. And what you're seeing is that both Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black individuals have significantly higher concentrations of this particular phthalate metabolite, monoethyl phthalate, which is a metabolite of diethyl phthalate, which is commonly used in personal care products and can hold fragrance into these products. And so, regardless of the gestational age across pregnancy, we see these higher concentrations. Interestingly enough, we see this decline in the Hispanic population's concentrations. And, that is actually really important to note. That again goes back to this modifiable, ability that we can actually maybe reduce the exposures. And what we've done to kind of look at this is that there are sources of this exposure that are changing. And so again, it's really great that we can modify this. But anyway, we met the second condition, that there is indeed an association. So second condition of environmental health disparity. And then lastly, is there an association between the environmental exposure of interest and the health outcome of interest? This is data also from Life Codes pregnancy cohort published by Dr. Kelly Ferguson, and showing that when you're looking at concentrations of some of these chemicals, we see almost a twofold increased odds for those who have the highest concentration of some of these phthalates compared to those with the lowest concentration for having a preterm birth. So again, we've met all of those conditions. Indeed, there is an environmental health disparity. And the challenge that we often have here is, do we stop there? We've defined this, have been in discovery mode, but how do we move beyond discovery mode to actually start really seeing if there's something impactful that we can do about this. So what I want to start with is this downstream, where we usually start, and looking at the environmental exposure and the health outcome, and then moving upstream as we consider this issue of environmental justice and health equity. So to give you a little bit more background on the exposure that we're going to be talking about, there's a variety of chemicals in consumer products. Those chemicals can range from things that are included in pesticides to this increasing awareness of our water supply being contaminated by per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, as well as food packaging that includes these surfactants. Phenolic compounds that are like benzophenone 3 and what used to be triclosan included in toothpaste, to flame retardants that are used in our furniture and technology devices. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be speaking a lot about plasticizers, and I mentioned that these are found in personal care products and food packaging, as well as medications. And so I showed you this slide earlier, and just to kind of noting again that, we see these disparities in chemical exposures, and it is quite worrisome. And so I've also shown this slide, and what I'd also like to just say is that oftentimes we do stop here. And sometimes we will move on and, make adjustments. And I don't know if you just noticed, but I circled the adjustments that we've made. So in epidemiology, we really love to build our best models. And so we'll adjust away things like race, ethnicity, and education, except as I mentioned earlier, those really contribute to the social and contextual factors that could be driving the exposures that we're seeing. So we have to ask ourselves the question, should we be adjusting for these factors? Is that the appropriate thing to do? The other thing that we often do in epidemiology, and I certainly have seen this in other study designs in basic science, where we'll actually stratify. And so we'll look at different subgroups of individuals. And what I'm noting here, this is data from South Carolina, done by Michael Bloom, which, by the way, this actually was a beautifully done study. And so they didn't just stop here. But oftentimes the researchers, investigators will look at the stratified analyses. What you're seeing here is when you're looking at this monoisobutyl phthalate, or MIBP, commonly found in a variety of consumer products, including personal care products, a much stronger association or odds ratio in the Black group compared to the white group, which suggests that there's some sort of effect modification. And if we stop there, we reify this idea that race is a biological construct, except it's not. Race is a social construct. And it really, my skin color has nothing to do with my ability to metabolize a particular phthalate, for example. And so this, what's at play here? What's really going on? And actually, what I'll just say to kind of highlight, these investigators went on and really noted that there were differences in the concentration levels and so on between these populations that could really be impacting and influencing these associations. So in doing so, they start moving upstream and thinking about this question of behavioral factors. And this is really at the individual level, thinking about whether it's diet or product use, other things that are within the context of lifestyle that could be impacting environmental exposures with subsequent impact on health outcomes. So how do we go about designing studies to do that? Well, one way that we can do this is really looking at product use, and in this case, product use in urinary phthalate metabolite concentrations. This is data from the Environmental Reproductive Glucose Outcome Study. And I'm presenting a heat map, really looking at the percent difference as it relates to these chemical concentrations measured in urine and product use across the x-axis here. And what you're seeing is, for example, the use of nail polish being, having a much, individuals who use this have a much higher concentration of monobenzyl phthalate, which again, these butyl phthalates are commonly found in nail polish, for example. Likewise, much higher concentrations of these two phthalate metabolites, as well as when you're looking at things like hair gel, for example, higher concentrations of some of these chemicals. So when thinking about what could be driving those higher concentrations of the chemicals, is it, again, just the metabolism? Well, interestingly enough, we did a study, this is back in the early 2000s, the Greater New York Hair Product Study, where we looked at hair product usage patterns among different racial ethnic groups living in New York City. And we shared our most commonly used hair products list with Silent Spring Institute, and Dr. Jessica Helm and her colleagues analyzed our list from the study of most commonly used Black hair care products, and found that every single one of them, unfortunately, contained multiple forms of endocrine disrupting chemicals, ranging from alkylphenols to parabens and phthalates, as well as UV filters. And this is quite problematic. These are things that are over the counter that contain, really potentially harmful chemicals. So, what might that mean for individuals? So what we did was to actually look at a subset of those same hair products, and we worked with the University of Belfast, Dr. Lisa Connolly and her team, to run hormone receptor assays. And what I'm showing you here is data from 6 of the hair products, noting that whether they're hair lotion, leave-in conditioners, hair oils, or these forms of hair products known as root stimulators, each one of them was able to operate either as an agonist or an antagonist for a variety of hormone receptors. And that's, in my opinion, problematic. And even at what might seem like lower levels, the challenge here is that people are using these products on their scalp and hair every single day, sometimes multiple times. And what are the implications of this, particularly when we know that reproductive health is very much connected to these hormones? And so to have something that is over the counter that, again, you can use it multiple times a day, what are the implications here? So if we move further upstream and think about not just the individual level behaviors, but also what are the social and cultural drivers that really are impacting these downstream factors. We want to think about differences in product use by race ethnicity, for example. And so this is, again, data from the Life Codes pregnancy cohort, over 600 pregnant individuals. And I'm showing you this data because there are differences. For example, perfume use is more commonly used in Hispanic and Black individuals. And again, these scented fragrance products contain these phthalate chemicals, as do nail polish. Again, significantly higher proportion of individuals using nail polish in the Black community compared to a higher proportion of non-Hispanic white individuals using cosmetic products. And what implications, as I just showed to you, might that have for differences in chemical exposures? With respect to hair products that are relevant to the study that I mentioned, the Greater New York Hair Product Study, we saw this is data from that study showing differences by race ethnicity, where almost all African American and African Caribbean women reported ever using hair oils, and hardly any, for example, non-Hispanic white women, for example, reported using hair perms, for example. So again, when you're thinking about what's the impact on things that are hormonally active and that contain things like phthalates and parabens that can be used multiple times a day and have this difference in distribution of usage patterns, what are the impacts and implication on health outcomes? And so when we're thinking about this, one of the challenges is that race ethnicity, there's again, these racial ethnic differences in product use, but also the fact that our policies here in the United States do not require the full disclosure of ingredients on labels. And so this was actually looking at products based on their labeled ingredients. So things like fragrance, for example, are included, as are parabens, but then other knowledge of other chemicals such as phthalates aren't included on those. Nonetheless, when you're looking at things like, for example, placenta, which is used in some hair products, along with fragrance and parabens, we noted that about 50% of African Americans compared to about 7% of white Americans were using, or in this study, were using this particular, were using these labeled products. And so, what are the implications? I showed you this panel earlier, but I just want to note that it doesn't just stop at monoethyl phthalate. So you saw higher nail polish use among the non-Hispanic Black community and higher perfume and another use among the Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black populations. And what's worth noting here is that, just higher concentrations. In fact, for almost every single one of these, this is in a pregnant population, higher concentrations of these chemicals that are associated with a variety of adverse outcomes, including preterm birth. So we wanted to, take the step back, looking again at that further upstream component and really thinking about, what are the implications? Is there something there that we can modify with respect to sources of those chemical exposures? So here we're using data from the Environmental Reproductive Glucose Outcome Study, where we have 4 different visits that range across pregnancy, similar to the Life Codes pregnancy cohort. And what you'll note here is that individuals that were using hair oils daily, so these are really highly fragranced products, from the data that I showed you a few minutes ago, contain a variety of things ranging from phthalates to phenols and so on. But daily use of these is associated with a 10-day earlier delivery. And that's really quite problematic and also really helpful. Like, maybe there's something we can do about the content of hair oils or the recommendations we have about hair oil use, particularly as it relates to later pregnancy, a time period where maybe exposure, this could be a sensitive window where exposure to these things could really expedite labor and delivery. So what about even further upstream? Is there something that we can really think about in the context of the political context? So I'd like to, for those of you who are unfamiliar with historic redlining, introduce this concept because this was a policy or set of policies that were enacted as a part of the New Deal back in the late 1930s that really made it, possible for white homeowners to purchase land and obtain mortgages in communities that were green and blue lined, but made it incredibly difficult for, if not impossible, for individuals living in predominantly Black and immigrant communities to receive mortgages. And home ownership is the primary source of wealth in the United States. So in these communities where it was predominantly Black and immigrant, these were lined as red and to some extent yellow lined communities. This is showing here the Boston area. And this has had real implications despite the fact that these policies were outlawed in the 1960s. There's still implications on health even today. And to show you this, we've recently done a study looking at historic redlining here in Massachusetts. This is data coming from the Massachusetts birth registries. And I'll just note here that you can still see that even today, while non-Hispanic Blacks make up about 8% of Massachusetts birthing people, they are overrepresented in yellow and red-lined communities. And particularly here in the Boston area, one of the things that is happening is gentrification, particularly of the red-line communities, which is moving individuals into the yellow-lined communities that may have historically been in the red-line communities. Those communities were still underserviced, and roadways, other things were built in, and I'll show you in just a second. This has also had real implications for the chemicals that I was just talking about. But to show you what the impact has been, this is data looking at associations between historic redlining and pregnancy outcomes. And what you can see is that for the yellow and red line communities, compared to the green or the most privileged communities, those that were seen as best, if you will, much higher odds of these conditions ranging from pre-gestational diabetes to gestational diabetes, chronic hypertension, and pregnancy-induced hypertension, which is quite problematic, particularly for those conditions that are chronic. That means individuals are entering into pregnancy already with these conditions, and what are the implications? But even then, these adverse health outcomes during pregnancy. And I would just like to say that, one of the driving factors is availability of safer products. So it turns out that even if you look within the same store, in two different communities, you will not find the same products always being sold in those same stores. This is preliminary data that we worked on a few years ago that led to some data I'll show in just a second, showing you that here, going from left to right, from a lower income, higher percentage minoritized population, we see higher levels of or higher risk score for example, hair products, with this risk score coming from the Environmental Working Group and signaling that these products contained many more chemicals and ingredients that were associated and linked to adverse health outcomes. And this is in lower income, more minoritized population compared to a higher income population, less minoritized population, which on average was about 3.5. So really concerning. And so when we looked at this, we're currently underway. We've collected almost 20,000 products data looking across the city of Boston. So this is just a snapshot from earlier this year. You'll soon be able to see on our environmental racism story map, many more communities included. But what you'll see here is these communities down here have a higher level of poverty, and yet they also have a higher percentage of chemicals that were deemed to be more harmful. In fact, about almost 60% higher risk of having more harmful chemicals or more harmful products in those communities. So really, we need to get to this point of asking about the impact, the influence of environmental justice and how we can integrate this into our work. And I would just say that I've been focusing a lot on this in the context of beauty justice and thinking about personal care product chemicals. I've talked a lot about hair products, but you could think about this in the context of skin lightening, creams, and scented products, cosmetics, and nail polishes, for example. And I'd like to say in the context of thinking about the way that we design studies, we really need to move from a state where we think that it's sufficient that we just stratify our analyses based on race, ethnicity, to really thinking about the need for an intervention. And so thinking more about mediation and kind of this linkage that I've been making across this presentation, moving upstream and thinking about the interconnectedness of these different research questions that we might be able to ask together. Because at the end of the day, we really do need to move from an inequitable situation to a situation in which we have justice. We remove the barriers. And so some of that might be inclusive of thinking about things like hair products or other things that from a behavioral perspective are impactful. And I would say in the beauty justice context, what are the social factors that are driving that? It's not just, individual level behaviors, but what we value in our society and what we also make available to people. And so to wrap this up and kind of leave you all with some thoughts, how can toxicology, for example, incorporate some of these principles of environmental justice? And I would say, ask more just and equity-oriented questions. So I work with colleagues who do a lot of research in this space, and I suggest, for example, to them, take a look at the different exposure concentrations of different marginalized populations. And when you're designing your experiments, think about how you can construct an experiment that is representative of the population to really embed environmental justice and health equity into the questions. And also thinking about designing more real world and solution oriented experiments. So again, we're not just the environmental exposures, but all of these various things are happening to us. One of the colleagues that I work with, Dr. Marissa Terry, has designed a very interesting set of experiments that really takes into consideration deprivation and in animal models, and thinking about how both in the context of stressors that come from deprivation in combination with the chemical exposures, what impact might that have on health? And really thinking about partnerships that one can build across fields and across disciplines and within communities. Again, I started this talk with saying that many of us are funded by the National Institutes of Health and other taxpayer funders. And so this funding organization, so this really is imperative that we think about working even with community members and really getting a better sense of what their concerns are in the context of this. And then I can't undersell the importance of research dissemination and effective science communication. I will say to you that as a trained environmental reproductive epidemiologist, I received little to no science communication outside of what we're doing here now with PowerPoint presentations. And yet the public, clinicians, policymakers are thirsty for our ability as public health practitioners and scientists to really come to the table, being able to translate our findings for the lay and to do that in an effective way. And so we're doing some of that work through recognizing, for example, that environmental health is not included in the medical school curriculum. And so there are opportunities here to really increase and improve environmental chemical exposure awareness and health equity issues in that space through improvement in environmental health literacy of clinicians. And so right now we're working on a healthcare intervention in this space. We're also doing a lot within our community, really improving the limited awareness of consumer product safety and health, really working with our colleagues across multiple disciplines and working with our community and advocacy organizations with train the trainer sessions, having a social media campaign and an environmental racism story map, which I'm more than happy to share with you all, which is available on Harvard Chan's website. And then there's a variety of resources that are at your disposal that I would just encourage you, for those of you who are interested, we have a 2-day workshop coming up on environmental justice that really is for anyone who's interested and would love to have you attend. That's co-hosted by Columbia University, Harvard Chan, and UCSF. Because at the end of the day, that increased training, that increased awareness, And really thinking about it from a multi-pronged approach can lead us from a model that looks like this to a model that looks like this. So I'd like to acknowledge and thank my research team and funding organization, and I would take any questions.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Just so you all know, we have a Teams chat usually going on with my co-hosts, and everybody's like, this is so interesting, and it's really, really interesting. So I am curious, we have a couple of questions from the audience, and one of them is going back to something you talked about a little bit, but what is the FDA and Consumer Product Safety Commissions doing about these products? It seems like there's knowledge, so what?
Yeah, this is an ongoing issue. So at the federal level, laws have not changed since the real change around what is allowed in products and what our process has not changed since 1938. As you all know, there are thousands of more chemicals available since 1938. And so this kind of idea that, that there's been improved regulation, that's really been led at the state level, with California and other states kind of leading the charge around disclosures, regarding what is in products, banning some chemicals. But again, we're talking dozens rather than the hundreds that the EU has banned. And yet we know a lot about these. And so how can we improve our policies and regulations around this? I think there's real need for that improvement.
Yeah, I think something related, has this research that you presented been used to create change? And policies are one way to create change, but are there other educational campaigns for people or other ways that change is occurring from this work?
Absolutely. So what has been really nice to see is, in starting this work some time ago, there was a lot of pushback just starting from endocrine disrupting chemicals and women's health. What are you talking about? So endocrine disrupting chemicals were, not, a couple of decades ago, extensively evaluated in women. And so we've been behind on that, in that. And so it's really taken off in the last decade or two, really thinking about the health of expecting people and female reproductive health more broadly. With that has come increased awareness by our various funding organizations. And so improvements in funding opportunities in these areas has started to occur, in addition to state level policy changes that, again, I don't know that I personally, but I see myself cited sometimes in some of this work. So I'm excited to see that we've gone from a place in space where we don't really have knowledge of, or we don't really discuss this, to a place in time where there's increased funding and regulations and policies around this.
Okay. So a couple of technical questions. Do you know if it's known how phthalates in hair oils cause preterm birth? Do we know mechanisms for these sorts of things?
So really good question. So there's a number of kind of hypotheses by which we think there might be linkages. So Dr. Kelly Ferguson, who was among the first to publish on this, posited that it was really an inflammatory response. So we know that phthalates have, some of them have a pro-inflammatory response, meaning that they can increase both oxidative stress and other signals down the line. So that was one proposed pathway. Other proposed pathways, as you saw from the hormone receptor assay, include their ability to operate as progesterone, in some cases an agonist or antagonist. Progesterone is known to be involved, as is estrogen, in labor and parturition. And so perturbing that kind of very delicate state could also be a part of that process.
Okay. Generally speaking, our mechanisms, they tend to be unknown and elusive. Is that, do we have good understanding of any mechanisms? Are there any clear ones where we we know for sure what's going on?
I don't know that there's anything for certain, right? But I will say that there's been, so Dr. Jennifer Adibi, for example, has been doing a lot of work looking at the role of, for example, phthalates on placenta and looking at epigenetic changes that could occur that really could contribute to, a variety of adverse pregnancy complications. Other things that we do know, for example, is phthalates, as likewise with per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, are able to bind to nuclear receptors, the peroxisome proliferator activated receptors. And so in my research that I didn't talk much about today, those PPARs, particularly PPAR gamma and alpha, those subforms, are known to be regulators of glucose and lipid metabolism. And so related to preterm birth, there is, again, another hypothesis, this idea that it's called the metabolic hypothesis, where when there is a discordance between glucose metabolism between the fetus and the pregnant individual, that can really initiate labor and parturition. And so in the context of something that's able to bind to these PPAR subforms that are really regulating glucose metabolism, something that is perturbing that regulation could not only have impact for conditions that I study, like gestational diabetes, but conditions like preterm birth. So definitely, even getting down to the molecular level, there are some we have a sense of some things that could be operating and happening.
Okay. Related, it seems like these questions are building. How about, so you talked about during pregnancy, but what about impacts to the children? I'm sure there's been work on that.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I would say that, if you look at the literature, there's much more published on children than there is in either kind of male or female kind of reproductive health in the adult years. And I think that it really speaks to this idea, these concepts of the when, the critical window of exposure to these chemicals in the context of the prenatal period. So we know that there are associations with a variety of adverse health outcomes, ranging from birth weight in early life to neurological and behavioral changes in childhood, obesity, and that there are some sex differences with respect to that. So yes, there's absolutely a larger literature in that space of child health outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so another question is, so kind of moving back to what's happening around the ideas that you presented. What are we doing about it? Is there a movement to encourage or require labeling, such as contains endocrine inhibiting ingredients, similar to what we do with food packaging and GMO?
It's a really great question. I think that there are a number of ongoing initiatives, that are really trying to push forward, appropriate and adequate labeling, as well as removing these things. Like it's not, I think it's the combination. We don't really want these in our products. Companies are making these same products for a population in the European Union that has banned these. So it would be nice to not include them at all. But to your point, like where they are included, I will tell you that I just started gardening, a little anecdote, and first year doing this, and went to like a Home Depot and saw labeled on the fencing that I was thinking about getting, contains reproductive toxicant. And this is because California now requires labeling. And so they specify that, they're not going to make a different product for California and the rest of us, So now what has really leading to kind of industry-wide changes in labeling is these state laws. So I think it's starting to happen.
Right. And that's similar in my environmental toxicology world. We see things happen in California and then they play out in other parts of the country, which is it's an effective way for things to happen. But
absolutely, it's an effective way. It's unfortunate that we can't do that, at the national level, but at least we have something, right?
we found a backdoor way to it, I think. I'm really interested. For me, this idea of beauty justice is new, and that's in part because it's not. I'm an environmental non-human toxicologist. I'm interested if you could maybe just spend a little time with the history of it and how it became such a, I mean, a clearly defined issue.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are so many kind of structural factors that are at play here. And so I will speak to the US, although to be honest, this extends beyond the United States. So you think about the colonial context of this, but how we define beauty is very culturally based. And so really what drives that too, I remember driving down the street one day and seeing this appearance matters sign. And I thought to myself, that seems so superficial and yet so true, because it turns out that from an economic perspective, there's something about beauty, being taller, being more fair skinned, having straighter hair, that makes one more accepted into certain spaces. And it's not, when I say certain spaces, I don't mean that in like, oh, only like 5% of spaces. I mean like widely available, like who is called on as a child, who is going to get the promotion. All of that is dependent on what we, aesthetically in society have found pleasing. And in the United States, a lot of that is driven by our, history of slavery, our history of internment camps for people and what we value. And so what people will do to feel valued and to be able to get the jobs that they need to earn income and so on has really meant that people have relaxed their hair. They use maintenance products on a daily basis. It's not just hair perms that occur like, every 3 to 6 months, but it's also these daily maintenance products, skin lightening creams, as, individuals who are female presenting, oftentimes wearing cosmetics, perfumes, and so on. And all of that really accumulates over time. So mercury is contained in skin lightening creams. These hair products, as I've mentioned, contain a variety of chemicals. And when we do other things to our bodies to try to, not just fit in, not just belong, but to really be able to have, economic success like anyone else would like to have. So we have, the downstream or maybe more upstream effects of that have been around policies that start to outlaw the discrimination of individuals. Here in Massachusetts, we had a situation where young girls were banned from their school because they were wearing their hair in a protective hairstyle, just braids, like the braids that you might see some Black individuals wearing. And it was, the school just said, you can't wear braids, you have to wear your hair straight or down. And our hair doesn't grow out of our heads that way. And so there's a recent law that has picked up around the country called the Crown Act, that bans schools and workplaces from discriminating against individuals who choose to wear their hair in its own natural form, for example. But that has real implications of what we're exposed to. And so that's why I'm really being encouraging of, the way we study things and how we, set up our experiments to really take those things into consideration.
Yeah. Dr. James-Todd, I cannot imagine a better final speaker for this year. You're everything that I wanted this series to be. I hope you'll look at the chats because there's lots of people who've given you nice comments, and thank you for being here. So thank you very much. And we'll close off and thank everyone who's been part of our speaker series for this year, both the audience and our speakers. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.